I feel the difference. So I was saying that if yesterday evening at Bezalel I addressed my questions related to my three books, Rational Aesthetics, Post-Production and Radicant, I will try today to go a bit further, or anyway aside from these books, talking about addressing the question of time in contemporary art and the way our vision of time and the way it evolves and transforms itself today, you know, due to technological reasons, economical reasons, social reasons, is actually affecting the way we see art and the way art is produced. That was my ambition for today, for this new, let's say, field of research. And I might starting with a gesture which is not very frequent actually in the art of the 20th century, but you know, which is used by some artists which I'm interested in, which is digging. You know, digging has never been a modernist gesture at all, because it's a practice that's directed towards the past. You're digging to find something from the past. Excavation is the archaeological gesture by excellence. And it doesn't really belong to the story of the avant-garde and the modernist, you know, art of the 20th century. But recently, a few years ago, I read a very interesting text by the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, who was explaining that, according to him, the beginning of modernism was the discovery of the oil fields in the 19th century American West. For him, this discovery of oil in the Wild West of the time was the primitive gesture, the primitive scene, in a way, of modernity. But then it was a superficial excavation at the time. You know, all the witnesses from this time talk about the lack of depth in the digging, in the excavation. But today, and I quote Peter Sloterdijk, our lifestyle is still based on the possibility of wasting the energy stored at the fossil layer. That is, we have led our bets on explosion. We are all fans of explosions, he goes on. Admirers of that fast release of great quantities of energy. I believe that the adventure movies of today, the action movies, are all grouped around that second primitive scene of modernity, the explosion of a car or a plane. End of quote. I think it's something that we can verify, in a way, in the iconography of the 20th century. The stream, the jet, the explosion pervades the representations that the 20th century made of itself. I think in terms of the avant-garde of the beginning of 20th century, Dadaism is, you find around and behind every gesture which is Dada, the idea of the explosion. And to quote only a few gestures from 20th century or movements, think about the homage to New York that Jean Tinguely made in 1960, which was a huge machine that was supposed to explode, and that did explode actually in New York. If you look at only representation, actually pop art, for example, is a good example of it. You know, if you look at it, actually, it's also a way to represent reality which is burst out. And the big, you know, gesture of the pop artist is the blow up, which is related also to the explosion, this liberation of quantities of energy. Of course, you can always find counter-examples of it. I'm thinking about surrealism, which defined itself as a nocturnal and introspective movement, but which explored the world of dreams, so also the depth of the unconscious. And here we are into digging again. But it's to find really an iconography of digging and excavation, you have to wait till the 1960s with artists such as Gordon Matta Clark, Robert Smithson, even Eva Esser in some ways, and a few others. And of course, the land art in general was much based on excavation. What it makes me think that if we look at it, back, all of modern art was essentially related to plainness, to flatness, in a way. It was born of the refusal to dig into the canvas, born of the rejection of the illusion of depth, actually. Modern turns flat into a positive element. And in a way, the abyss, put aside surrealism and some others, represents its main enemy, in a way. We can take two examples of it, actually, 1 century, away from each other. If you take Edouard Manet on one side and Andy Warhol on the other side, you have two different types of allegories of the surface, two metaphysical tendencies in opposition to depth and the existence of a background world. It's the French writer and poet Paul Valéry who wrote, "What is deepest is the skin." And both Manet and Warhol describe a skin reality that is not accompanied by an inside, with no mystery other than the continually renewable, visible world. If you take The Balcony by Manet, for example, in 1868, it's really a revendication of the surface against classical illusionism. If you read the critics of the time, of course, it's quite obvious that they absolutely loathed this kind of painting, since it destroyed, in a way, all the values they were developing and the spontaneous type of metaphysics that supported the discourse concerning reality. Today, and that's the reason, I think, why this subject does interest me, it seems that we're living a kind of surface crisis, in a way. But we will come back on it, and the major symptom of it might be found in our relation to the screen, actually, because screens are absolutely everywhere in our reality today. There's no opposition anymore between surface and depth into the world of representation, because we are actually accompanied by this flatness, by the screen. But we'll get back on this subject before. First, I'm going to want to insist on the idea of digging and excavation. Because throughout the 20th century, even when an artist made a reference to what could be called an arche from archaeology, which means historical foundation, a rock-bottom idea of reality. Even then, it was made through the affirmation of flatness and verticality. I'm thinking specifically about Barnett Newman's zips, for example, which are actually the emblems of this modernist iconography. You can take also the sculptures of Barnett Newman, for example, Here 1 or Here 2, which are actually, pure verticality. And in this term, they recall Giacometti's skinny lines also. Or even the late, more pyramidal works that Barnett Newman does, like Chartres and Jericho in 68, 69. What's interesting here is that Newman recuperated the very mythical origins of sculpture, which is erecting a promontory, the stele, for example, the ziggurat. In short, it's just, implementing in the reason a form which rises up and separates from the earth. sculpture, in this way, could be qualified as a kind of polar opposite to the earth. It's the dominion, it's the domain of the dead, of the forgotten, of the buried. It's the domain of the informal and the mad. And here we have another way to envision the opposition between ground and form that we have in the most classical, modernist painting. Because development of American painting, let's say Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Ad Reinhardt, came from overcoming the fundamental opposition of the earth, from which arises the sculpture. Like the critic Clement Greenberg was saying, the painting is still a window, even if that window is closed. From this point, with this all over, that is characteristics of Jackson Pollock's painting, the form is confused with the background, and they are both united by the painting's plainness, which is defined as a pure optic surface. It's interesting to see that this unity permits an artist like Ad Reinhardt to state that painting that then enters into post-history, what he calls a time out, a form of timelessness, as he writes. He does not deny that the object, the painting, belongs to a specific historical moment, of course, when it's done, but he insists on the fact that there is no ancient or modern, no past or future in art. And that the painting, whatever it is eternally found in the present. I quote Ad Reinhardt, a work of art is always present. It could mean several things, but the one thing that for me is the most important might be found in the notion of time itself, actually, and the way an artwork inscribes itself into the dimension of time. Time here seen as in its historical dimension. Because any artwork, if you think about it, goes both ways. If you take any important artwork, let's say the first ready-made by Marcel Duchamp, or the White Square and White by Kazimir Malevich, to take very well-known examples. What's interesting in them, if you look, is that, of course, they produce consequences. You have many people, many other artists who will use them as a starting point, or react against them, or somebody will see them and will do this or that. You have a chain of consequences for which are more important, of course, is if the gesture has been, strong, and if the work, produces energy and thought. But it's not the only effect it does have, because it also creates causes in the past. It goes backwards. It's I think it's the French group of writers, the Oulipo, were talking about plagiarist by anticipation. It's also the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, who was talking about the precursors of Kafka, for example, saying that actually all the people were actually that he was mentioning were existing in a different way after the existence of Kafka, after Kafka's writings, which means that every important gestures produces a genealogy that we had never seen before. Sometimes, for example, and then I can go back to relational aesthetics that we were mentioning, it's interesting, I had a very interesting example. It's after the publication of this book, a few artists that were never really considered, like, for example, in Brazil, Elio Itichica, or in America, Tom Marioni, could be seen in a different way. Their work was meaning something else. They were becoming actually the precursors of this generation of artists that I was mentioning in the book. The same way, if we take pop art, for example, if you look at Gerald Murphy in the 1930s, he might be considered as a precursor of pop art, but it was not visible before pop art. That's what I mean when I say that any artwork, but it's of course valuable for any work that's significant, produces and changes the past in a way. It goes both ways. What has been really dramatically changing in the last 30 years is our loss of the idea, or loss of confidence also in the idea of the future. You know, we were mentioning the discovery of oil fields in the American West as the primitive scene of modernism. What's really interesting to look at is the fact that postmodernism, as we call it, has been started to be discussed in the 1970s, let's say between 72, when Charles Jenks, the architect, coins the name, in a way, between 72 and I would say 79, you know, when Jean-François Lyotard writes about the postmodern condition. It's in between that actually something happens, an event in thought, an event into the world's, you know, mentality, which, according to me, is very important and is again related to oil, which is crazy if we think about it. But we follow this thread, we can actually, you know, build another type of story. What happened in '73? You know, few important things, and one of them, of course, is the oil crisis, which suddenly made all the Western countries take consciousness that the energy reserves were not infinite, and that all of this might have an end, actually. Before that, before this exact date, 73, 74, which is the exact moment of the development of what is called now postmodernism, before that, nobody was really aware of it. It's the exact moment where the Western world stops believing in the future as a kind of infinite line. It's the moment where they think that, you know, it might end sooner or later. And I really believe, even if it's, again, a story, that postmodernism has to do with this. And that this modernist period that we could, you know, we could see it from 19th century discovery of oil fields in America, ending with the first oil shock in '73, leaving the way to what is called postmodernism. But I will come back on this. Because the idea of the future has been, in a very clear way, the idea of progress, for example. The idea of the future was the instrument of command which modernist artists used to describe the present. And what's really striking today is to see that the future has only a presence in the universe of science fiction from yesterday, actually, an already dated literary and film genre, whose origins are again to be found in 19th century. We have, by the way, a kind of possible story starting today, and something that is related to the future. It's the use of technology, and especially the notion of the future today, as we see it, especially in sci-fi movies, is expressed through special effects all the time. But there are many signs in the art world, in the work of the artists of today, that indicate that the past has actually substituted the future as an object of interrogation and concern. Think about, for example, the really increasing obsession with traceability of products, traceability of destinations, the omnipresence of the ecological catastrophe as a kind of collective horizon, our distrust in utopian politics. This tends to erase any representation of the future. The fact is, we live with a kind of rear view mirror all the time. We might explain this in a way by the fact that the past seems to represent the only stable and calming element that we have. But actually, I'm not sure I would follow this lead. But anyway, the past and the representation of the past through the forms of history and some reflections that are made by the artists today, which are actually digging into the past, to explain and discuss our present, has led to the uprising of the figure of the archaeologist in art. The archaeologist uses or produces plans to locate him or herself in a space as well as time. He or she establishes the link between the figure of the modernist explorer and the critical artist who is contemporary of cultural studies today. I would like to evoke a very important artwork, according to me, which is coming exactly at this moment of this turn between modernism and postmodernism, which is Hotel Palenque by the American artist Robert Smithson. It's a series of slides, actually, which is documenting the hotel he was living in at the time in Mexico. And it's a kind of inquiry. He really, learns the history of this hotel, is digging into his archaeological reality, trying to understand the physicality of the field on which this hotel has been built, etc., etc. And it's kind of conference, a kind of lecture, with slides, very simple, really nothing, complicated in the process or the device he's using. And I think this piece is a turn, really. Is the apparition of the artist as a pure archaeologist, obsessed by the traceability of the present. He developed this theory, Robert Smithson developed this theory of the ruin in rivers, which is very useful for us to understand the reality we live in, actually. The ruin in rivers is a kind of inversed archaeology, in a way. And as he did in many works, actually Robert Smithson was exploring the failed modernist buildings or the failed modernist architecture in general, in order, and spoke about it and presented it as if it was something from the past. It was the present or very near past, actually. But this change in the focus makes us understand in a totally different way the world we live in. There are many ruins in rivers, around us, here and many other places in the world. They are actually everywhere. And after having taken this series of photographs of this strange hotel, which gave birth to Hotel Palenque, Robert Smithson gave a lecture at the University of Utah where he analyzed with extreme precision this dismantled, de-architecturalized and off-centered place, illustrating the idea of entropy applied to culture. According to Smithson, the world was dominated by entropy. And the fact is, at the very source of his work, you can find always the fossil. And we're getting back to fossil energies and to oil. Today we have many artists who are actually working like this. What's really striking when you visit galleries, in New York or London or Paris or anywhere, is the fact that you have many artists who actually use fragments, historical fragments, elements from the past, documents coming from the past, in order to address issues which are present. Again, we shifted. It's not the future that leads, or the utopia that leads the efforts of the artist to make us understand our present, it's the past. There was a very interesting art critic and art historian who wrote a lot about Robert Smithson in the 60s, who was also a specialist of the Aztec civilization, the pre-Columbian civilizations. His name was George Kubler, and in 62 he published a book which is absolutely fascinating, which is called The Shape of Time, and he defines already, with a lot of advance according to me, this new field of investigation with incredible lucidity. And this is something that is really true now, I think. And I'm going to quote Kubler. He writes, "Instead of occupying an expanding universe of forms, which is the contemporary artist's happy but premature assumption," here it describes the modernist world. Instead of occupying an expanding universe of forms, we would be seen to inhabit a finite world of limited possibilities, still largely unexplored, yet still open to adventure and discovery, like the polar wastes long before the human settlement. Instead of regarding the past as a microscopic annex to a future of astronomical magnitude, we would have to envisage a future with limited room for changes, and these of types to which the past already yields the key. This, what is describing here, is exactly what we can feel actually in the way, in the relationship that artists have to the past and the future. The future is shrinking. The past is growing more and more and more all the time. Our present is the archaeological ruin, the ruin in rivers that Robert Smithson was talking about. And one of the possible explanations to it might be the fact that for the first time in the history of mankind, we all here in this room are living in a world which is finite. It's mapped entirely since 2001, which is a very important and historical date that nobody really cared about. But it's the year where the last blanks on the world map were filled by the satellites, sorry. Since then, we have a representation of every millimeter of this planet, and this is an historical fact, and it's with a great magnitude, and it changes in a way because we unconsciously know it. Obviously, we are living in a world where there is nothing to discover anymore. There's no terra incognita. That's finished. How could it not produce effects in our psyche and in the arts? Obviously, it does. And strangely, if you look at what's left, what are the possibilities now? The last continent to be discovered is actually history. It's actually the past. It's the only place because we don't believe enough in the future anymore. It's the only place where we can make discoveries. It's not about the new anymore, it's about discovering, which is very different. I might, just to update this reflection, go to the thoughts of Walter Benjamin, who's a great thinker of the past, obviously. And the past that Benjamin is interested in was this unknown side of reality that was appearing in the light of the present, actually. He wrote this absolutely incredible sentence, which is also very inspiring, which is, knowledge comes only in lightning flashes. And we'll keep that in mind because I think we are going to see how deep is this sentence. I'm going on quoting Walter Benjamin. Every present day is determined by the images that are synchronic with it. Each now is the now of a particular recognizability. In it, truth is charged to the bursting point with time. The point of explosion, and nothing else, is the death of the intention, which coincides with the birth of authentic historical time, the time of truth. It's not that what is past casts its light on what is present, or what is present its light on what is past. Rather, and that's the important point, image is that wherein what has been comes together in with the now to form a constellation. Here, Walter Benjamin introduces to the idea of what he calls the dialectical image. This image which has two sides, past and present, and with scintillation actually gives us, in a flash, again, as he writes, a knowledge not only on the past but on the present. The dialectical image, he defines it, is an image that emerges suddenly, in a flash. What has been is to be held fast, as an image flashing up in the now of its recognizability. And here, I wanted to make a comparison with another text by George Kubler that I've been discussing a few minutes ago. Strangely enough, talking about art, and in this book, The Shape of Time, in 1962, he writes something which is so much related to it. I quote, "Actuality is when the lighthouse is dark between flashes. It's the instant between the ticks of the watch. It's a void interval slipping forever through time. Yet the instant of actuality is all we ever can know directly, the present. The rest of time emerges only in signals, relayed to us at this instant by innumerable stages and by unexpected bearers. These signals are like kinetic energy stored until the moment of notice." The image might be, in the writings of Benjamin, as in George Kubler's thought, exactly like a constellation of stars, in a way. We see, if we look at the sky at night, a constellation is actually a condensation of time and space. It's not purely space. The stars whose light we see now might be coming from the past. They might be dead, like some supernovas who actually exploded millions of years ago, but whose light we still can see, actually. when we look at a constellation, we see something from the past, from the present at the same time. Which gives a particular light to a pattern which is really important in contemporary art, which is flickering images, which is exactly this lighthouse that George Kubler was talking about. You know, the moment you see something, then not. Or the dialectical image that Walter Benjamin was mentioning. I'm thinking, for example, of the series of phosphorescent drawings made by Philippe Parreno, which fade every minute and are reloaded by a violent lightning, by violent spotlight, over and over. I'm thinking also of the works where the British artist Kerrit Wynne Evans deliver messages or transcribes texts that are actually delivered in Morse code. I'm thinking also in a more metaphorical way to the way of working of artists like Maurizio Cattelan, for example. It's about flashes. It's about being seen in and recognized in one moment. That's the logic, specific, twisted logics of communication, but that's so much used today. It's the strategy of the flash, actually, the surprise effect. But of course, there are many modes of flickering. I could define it by like a regime of the visible, which is marked by intermittence. It's the programmed fading of what is presented to our eyes or to our perception. Another work by Philippe Parreno might be a good example of it. It's a kind of steel, it's a Christmas tree in steel, which is actually, whose title is Fraught Times. And it's a piece which has to be considered for 11 months of the year like an artwork, and in December as a Christmas tree. If you look at the work of Carsten Höller, also, the German artist, flickering is absolutely everywhere. And he uses a wall of flickering light bulbs to remind us of let's say, is alluding actually to the chickens raised in a kind of batteries. And it's really about persuasion and kind of hypnosis that is actually governing, according to him, determining our reality. This art of flickering works goes with a reality that also flickers, actually. And looking at those elements that we can see in today's art, you know, one might be interested also to look back and consider, which I still didn't do properly, but I'd love to do it once, to consider all the artistic devices which are actually including, for example, delays in art. And of course, you know, there's a very archetypal work. It's Marcel Duchamp's the great large glass, obviously, that he defined as a delay in glass, actually. It's time, again, the element of definition of the artwork. There's a new distribution between the direct, the deferred, and the archive in today's art. There's one element that we should never forget, because it also determines many things, is that today our world is a huge recording machine, actually. You all have iPhones, or, you know, you record things all the time. We all do this, you know. The whole world, our whole reality is recorded all the time. So even the satellite do that, you know. It's absolutely amazing to think that we are actually living in a world which is recorded minute per minute. We have never seen that. You know, our whole societies are machines producing archives all the time, and it's impossible to avoid it. What are we going to do with those archives? How can we learn to navigate throughout them? What for? That's a question that we might have to answer. It's not by surprise then that some artists, I'm thinking of Trisha Donnelly in North America, or Tino Segal, who actually refuse to record their work. Their art is performance-based, and they don't want any documentation of it. Because anyway, even if things are not shot or recorded, anyway, they will get into the huge archive that we are living in. This insistence on the here and now of the work, of the artistic event, and the refusal to record it represent, of course, a challenge to the art world, but its institutional nature, anyway, is a mighty archival apparatus. And that's what holds things together, in a way. That's this archival apparatus. What else is the art world, in a way? It's a process, a selective process of recording. I want to insist on this dialectical twist that Walter Benjamin was mentioning between the present and the past. Because Benjamin was, of course, himself an historian, a materialist historian. And he was particularly interested in the obsolete, the old toys, the signs coming from the 19th century, etc., etc. If you take this category of and try to look in the art world, you know, which artist would be interesting to, you know, give an answer to Walter Benjamin. I think again Philippe Parreno is highly interesting, because Parreno is searching for, might be one of the few artists who actually still go on developing an idea of the future, and it's rare enough to be, you know, underlined, I think. Parreno's work is based on the idea of the artifact from the future that will describe, in the world we live now, a kind of portrait of the 21st century and the future. But the big difference is that for Walter Benjamin, the examination of history is a rescue operation. By practicing quotation, which does not interpret, but as he says, photographs the past, and by approaching urban fragments from their phantasmagoric coating, Benjamin means to liberate the forces contained within, in order to bring it to the present, the contents that have been confiscated by the conquerors. To write about history, according to Benjamin, is to reveal the truth of history. It's to activate the present in a revolutionary sense. And Parreno is adopting the exact symmetrical position to this archaeological, let's say, mechanism in some ways. It's possible, Parreno says, to activate the present from the future, beginning with anticipation from scratch. What's striking, again, is the fact that today space and time seem to be at the point of merging and exchanging even their properties. Time, as we know it, we spontaneously define it as succession. And we identify space with simultaneity. But we now live in times in which nothing disappears anymore. The huge archival apparatus I was mentioning before. Everything accumulates under the effect of a frenetic archiving. And in a way, we don't have, for example, to just give an example of this, new idea of time. I remember that 20 or 30 years ago, there was real fashions, actually, which were happening in the cultural world. Today, we don't have fashions, but we have trends, which are a kind of microscopic version of it. Short-lived trends. For modernism, the past was representing tradition. And that's under this figure that it was fought, actually. And at the opposite, it was destined to be supplanted by the new, of course. This idea of the new is something that we don't have anymore. And for postmodernism, the past has a very different signification. Historical time took the form of a kind of catalogue or repertoire of styles. It just, again, it's not succession anymore, it's simultaneity. And the past here is defined as, in territorial terms, we could say. The most, spontaneous example of it is the fact that when you travel, for example, you might have the sensation sometimes, to change epochs at the same time. On the other hand, if you look at a book of art history today, you encounter a geography of contemporary styles and techniques. It's in a way the reason why a science called anthropology has been founded. In anthropology, the over there is spontaneously transformed into back then. And tourism, traveling, it's not only a change of scenery, it's also a change in time. As Claude Lévi-Strauss was saying in Sad Tropics, a journey occurs simultaneously in space, in time, and in social hierarchy. This phenomenon of space-time merging into a hyper-technologized world, transformed into a huge archival, could lead to the emergence of a kind of Borgesian aesthetics. Borgesian, to say that this aesthetics would be inspired by the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, I was mentioning at the beginning of these talks. Because he really several times, in a very obsessive way, alludes to the transformation of time into space. And he describes time as a kind of maze, a labyrinth, a non-linear, whose nature is to bifurcate. It's always forking all the time. He even looks the movement of time as he very several times mentions, flowing from the future into the past, like if it was a permanent production of a past. There was a short story named Clon Ugbar Orbis Tertius, where Borges just imagines a civilization whose inhabitants have developed a new relationship with metaphysics. For them, he writes, the world is not a concurrence of objects in space, but a heterogeneous series of independent acts. It's serial and temporal, but not spatial. In this civilization, producing, discovering, and exhuming objects are one and the same. and the archaeologist of this civilization, of Tlön, can as easily invent the objects they exhibit as much as unearth them. It's exactly the same. The fact is, and that's the point that Borges wants to make, discoveries are made in the past as well as in the present and the future. It seems sometimes that the contemporary art world resembles the civilization of Tlön, and its way of thinking starts to look like the one of the philosophers of Tlön. In the context of the very complex relations that many artists entertain with history today, and now at the end of the race for the new, that structured narrative of the artistic avant-garde has been generally acknowledged, now a formal discovery, the establishment of a relationship between the past and the present, is as much valorized today as an anticipation of the art of the future. This kind of exercise seems to belong to the past. And the idea of an art of the future is not necessarily something that we take into account anymore. To describe time, the French philosopher Michel Serres was calling for topology against metrics, which is the classical measure of time in seconds, minutes, hours. According to him, we make, and I quote, we make archaic, modern, and futuristic gestures all at the same time. Therefore, any event from history is multi-temporal, referring to the past, to the contemporary, to the future in a simultaneous way. Here again we find this idea of the constellation, and we find also this idea in topology that time might be not a linear, space, but more like a kind of, I don't know, for example, if you take an example, if you take a sheet of paper and you fold it several times, what was linear and flat is now much more complex. You have certain elements which are touching one to another that were not in connection 1 minute before. This might be the real representation of time, actually. A big folded space where sometimes elements from the past are coming to touch some elements of the future and the present. So what is clear to me, actually, today is the fact that artists build their pathways as much in history as much as in geography, and those two notions might even, fold much easier way than we think. I think the most interesting artists of our times might be the ones who actually take those ideas and have the intuition of those transformations and take them into account in their effort to produce space-time that is, actually. I invented a word to define this kind of a movement that the artist does, exploring the world. And this word is semionaut. The artist is a semionaut, from semios, the sign, and nautos, navigation, which means, in clear, the artist navigates throughout the signs. He or she finds his or her way into the huge forest of signs that we are living in today, which is more and more, crammed with objects and signs, obviously. So this exercise of navigation is more and more complex to be made. But what's interesting to see that in many artworks, many artists today are actually folding one to another elements that are separated by time and space, and putting them together to establish a comparison or a connection with them. Artists are semionauts who invent pathways throughout the global culture today. As they construct those pathways as much in history than in geography, I think that we might envision in a different manner our relation to what modernism or modernity is. One might not agree with that, but I tend to think that the modern is an occurrence in history. There was not only one modernity, which was end of 19th century and the big part of the 20s. I think there were many modern moments in history, which were all sharing an important element, which is the idea of the departure, leaving behind the old monumental apparatus and finding your way into a new blank space, a desert in a way, if you want. I think that's the modernist gesture par excellence. I think one cannot think about a modernity without it. And I really firmly believe that today we need a new modernity to rise up, because we cannot live forever under the domination of the prefix postmodernism, etc., which stamps us as inhabitants of the outskirts of history. And this modernity that I'm trying to look for the clues everywhere I go, this modernity might be not radical like the modernism of 20th century. Because as we know, radical means that belongs to the root. No, if you are radical, you erase the tree, you cut the branches, and you only keep the root, and you grow something else on it. That's being radical. There's another word that comes right after in every dictionary in Europe, which is redicant. And a redicant is an organism that grows its own roots while it advances, while it progresses, like ivy, for example, or strawberries. You can cut the original root, it still goes. And this botanical metaphor, for me, is very rich. It implies and generates many possibilities of being, many possibilities of relating to our culture, to the past, to the others also. The redicant is not necessarily doing a tabula rasa, is not erasing, destroying the past in order to make a new order appearing. The redicant has to engage a dialogue with the spaces and the space-times that he or she is crossing. It's a journey that we're talking about. And this journey is the constitution of the subject himself or herself. As we know, those are really important elements, I think, and the way we deal with history, the way we deal with time today, not only in art, but also, of course, in our own way of looking at the world, is absolutely crucial. there is a kind of ideal representation also that is made on the other side. For example, Bill Gates was calling for what he calls capitalism without friction, which means transforming the world into a place which would be borderless, only for commodities, of course. No friction, nothing to slow the hyper-speed movement of merchandisation. Time and history are exactly the opposite. They produce distinctions. They are factors of divisions. They are disruptive elements, obviously. And the logics of globalization tends to weaken those elements by diluting them in the unobstructed space of free trade. But it's not because Bill Gates uses a word that we cannot use it at our turn and do something different out of it, obviously. I don't think that the border in itself is a good thing. At least it's so present today in the mental representation that we make of the world. It's so present in the art world, so present in any representation, that we can interrogate ourselves on what it exactly means, actually. Is it this omnipresence of the border, critique or not? And this might be, of course, should be analyzed in a more precise way. I will conclude with the evocation of the main theorist and also a very inopportune thinker, main theorist of modernity, which was Charles Baudelaire, who was from scratch, actually, even if he was a commentator and a theoretician of modernity, also the most disillusionized commentator of this transition towards the industrial world. But Baudelaire was calling for jumping into the depth of the unknown to find something new, which might be actually the perfect resume, the perfect summing up of this big adventure that modernity has been. The depth on one side and the new on the other side. It's a figure which is, interestingly enough, obsolete already when the imagery of the surface emerged at the exact same time. I will conclude on this. Thank you very much. Seems like I've been digging a big hole, actually.
Are you aware of work of contemporary physics in time, as for instance, Aharonov, who speaks of two-timed variables?
This could be René Thom, actually, by the way.
He speaks of two-timed variables where a position now depends on its position in the future of a particle.
Schrödinger's cat.
Yes, yes. But he actually looks for a place to position free will, even though it sounds like determinism. I mean, his raison d'être would be to search for free will, but find a way to position it in the present. But for him, present is dependent on the future, using the classic notions of physics. And I was wondering if you were aware of these works.
A little bit, no. But it reminds me, talking about determinism and free will, maybe in a way, we should escape this binomial, in some ways. That's why I'm very much interested in as you were saying, in the text that Louis Althusser wrote at the very end of his life, called Materialism of the Encounter, which is absolutely not a theory of the encounter, by the way, but it's a text about chaos, and history. And history as nothing more than a collection of accidents, nothing more than a series of catastrophes in the physical term of the world, which is collisions between atoms that are actually, pushed away from what Democritus was calling the declinatio, and as they are shocking one another, create deviations and produce situations, circumstances which are actually born of a collision. So it's a interesting way, I think, to get out of the debate between determinism and free will. It's not the problem, it's all accidents.
What's your position about the truth of history? Because
the truth
of history. Because when Walter Benjamin talks about the present lighting the past and it flickering, and everything else you kind of continued on explaining, I couldn't help but notice that you aren't taking any relevancy to the truth of what history is and how we face with facts that we don't know if they really are or really aren't, which means that history is, in its base, kind of relativist. Though Walter Benjamin wasn't a relativist, but how do you face history not being something that's fundamentally true, but light it in the vision of the contemporary?
I think there's nothing more dangerous than the idea of truth in history. I cannot even envision thinking about it in a way, because as it's Lacan was saying, la vérité on ne peut pas toute la dire. You cannot say all the truth. There's always something that will miss. There's always something that will not be present, and it's impossible, metaphysically impossible, to think about a complete truth. And the truth is not complete, it's not a truth.
So you would say that a consequence is that truth is fundamentally irrelevant?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I do.
I do too.
Hello. I was wondering if you see any difference between the contemporary eschatological discourse in relation to other historical theories of the end of the world and energy is running out, etc. Is there anything different in today's vision?
I didn't. Where are you? Okay.
Right here.
Sorry. No, it was difficult for me to.
Yeah.
Can you reformulate the question?
Yeah, I was wondering, you were describing a state where resources are running out, etc. And I was wondering if you, and you elaborated that into thinking that there's no future, or we're not thinking of the future, when everything is mapped out. And I was wondering if you see any connection between this state and previous historical state of kind of imagining the world to be over. I mean, it's not the first time people have imagined the world to be over, right?
I think in the concept of future, the most important might not be the notion as itself, but the different formats where we encapsulate it. For example, in in USSR, in the 20th century, the future was seen as the scrolling of a scenario which was written in advance. This scenario implied the invention of a society without class, for example, and the victory of the proletariat over bourgeoisie. Okay, that's a scenario, and then you have the casting and the different players, and you go down the route. We don't have such a scenario now, actually, not even in the Western world, which was at the same moment, at the moment of progress and modernism, obsessed by this very notion of progress. It was not a scenario, it was more, how could we qualify it? A plan, maybe. It's the scenario against the plan. The plan is, establishing concrete objectives, concrete goals that you have to look for. We don't have that anymore, neither, in some ways. We're living with no scenario, no screenplay, and no plan. What's left? What's becoming really interesting is suddenly the relationship between neighbors in the same building. It's the last utopia that we actually do have, according to me. It's this micro-utopia that we can think about. But it's not about the future, it's about the present. I think we might have trouble enough with the present not to worry too much about the future, in a way.
Nicolas, I wanted to ask you a question. Do you feel that there is a sort of embarrassment for artists with the question of time?
Embarrassment?
Yes, sort of embarrassment to think through the notion of time. There's an easier recourse, obviously, to the notion of space or time through spatial categories.
I don't think it's such a problem for two reasons. One, I think the artists really have a system of captation of the presence which actually put them into relation with those new dimensions of time before me, before us in general. And what I can say about time today, I take it in the artworks. Secondly, I think it's not such a problem for an artist, because if you make any dot on a sheet of paper, or this, for example, here, if I write a little dot on this screen, it's space, of course, but it's also time, because it's the exact notation of a moment, So all signs are reversible, actually. It's still this dialectical image, but in nucleo, in an abstract form, in a way. Time and space just reverse their properties, in a very simple way in the artwork, I think.
Thank you for a very rich lecture. I was just confused because I have a straight social scientist mind. You referred actually to three, at least, perhaps more, notions of time and modernity. So the first one with which you opened was the explosion, the kind of twin tower thing, simultaneously, it's an instantaneous present. The second had to do with archiving, which is the capacity to store up and to simultaneously sift through a mass of information. And the third is the classical colonization of the future, the unknown, you know, that big inaugural moment and jump into the unknown, which is really the traditional way of envisioning the future. I call it the colonization of the future. So I was quite confused by the ways in which you actually moved between these different conceptions. I think there are more, actually, conception of Zion, much more in your lecture. These are the ones I could...
Obviously, yeah.
So what is it actually that you're ascribing to modernity? Because it's, I mean, you seem to be putting a lot of different things in it. So just please, conceptual clarification for me.
Sure. I'm not certain I can clarify myself totally on this, you know, because the fact is, I think when you refer to the unknown, that there's a part of unknown in the quest or the desire for modernity, in a way. Because what would it mean, in a way, in concrete terms today? I think what we need more concretely is a mental tool that would allow us to fight more efficiently by proposing something else, to fight more efficiently against the twofold, you know, danger that is actually, you know, more and more problematic. First, it's the huge phenomenon of standardization and uniformization that the economic globalization is actually implementing at the surface of the globe. And second, but it's like the bifurcation again, the resurgence of the fundamentalist, you know, ways of thinking, nationalist, you know, gestures, identitarian revendications, everything that belongs to the repertory of the hatred of the other and the refugee into one's own specificity as a weapon, I would say. So we need a tool, a mental tool, that would allow us to fight against those two elements at the same time, because they pretend, both sides pretend to be the truth again. Both sides pretend to be the future, in a way.
But art has played sociologically now a huge role in consolidating this ideology of authenticity and of the individual as his own or her own refuge against the world. It plays a huge ideological role in that, along with psychology and consumer culture. You know, you couldn't make sense of the figure of the modern artist without conceiving of that artist as...
I can, I think.
Well, maybe, you know, the artists now who have become aware of that ideology, but historically, art has become or has played this role. Historically, art has played this role of consolidating ideologies of individual authenticity, and particularity and singularity.
Well, it's not that much the question of singularity as such, as the way it is used. You know, singularity. I'm a pure nominalist, so of course singularity is my bread. Actually, I don't see anything else than singularities, so I cannot go against you, you know, on this. Obviously, no. I think the art teaches us to see the world as a pure collection of singularities. But I was not mentioning this. I was more mentioning identities, let's say singularity, taken as a kind of, as reified, I would say. How singularity can reify itself, be transformed into a kind of pure image, or again a weapon, again that excludes the other. So this type of singularity is not a singularity anymore. You know, it's unfortunately a totally Gregorian, its vulgarity, it's kind of a social glue identitarian glue that I was mentioning.
Small question. You were referring to one moment or another, I don't remember, you said something like the real representation of time, or if I understood you correctly, in a way, the way artists represent time in their work is something which interests you. Mm-hmm. But then what my question would be, since the word representation already encapsulates within it one specific modus of time itself, which is the present representation, whether we should not, in a way, try to think, rethink the notion of time within art, not beginning from the question of representation.
Yeah, representation is one aspect and one way art can deal with time, actually, but it's not the whole, content. Obviously, one could quote here the work of Onkawara as a pure representation of time, in a way, seen as a kind of diary, time as a kind of marker, a calendar. But also, what would be an evocation of time in art that would exclude representation?
I wouldn't
there
say
might a lot of them, actually. Sorry.
I wouldn't say exclude, but just maybe thinking about art not beginning from the function of art as a beginning from representation.
I think it's, let's say, if you take, for example, the perspective of the Rinascimento, and you can transcribe the perspective in terms of time. I think the correct equivalent of this, optical machinery today would be the network. Forms which actually are networks, like constellations are networks also, archipelagos are networks. But if you look at the way artists use space-time today, it's very often under the form of the network, or the reticular form, let's say, to be more general. The reticular is today very very much used as a way to discuss the boundaries between space and time, I think. If you look at an artist like Pierre Huyghe, for example, who is not using reticular forms himself, but is producing chains of events and forms which are extended both in time and space. I think this might be a new way of envisioning, the space-time for artists today. It's something which is emerging, according to me.
You mentioned two things that we should fight against. One is globalization, and the other is nationalism. And I wonder...
Any type of fundamentalism.
Yeah.
No.
And I wonder what we should fight for then.
But that's exactly what I'm trying to define. That's why, I think modernity is between the two. That's why I'm using this very old concept of modernity. One could say, why modernity? Because it provides, in a way, every time in history that it popped up, any time that the conditions were united to produce such an event as a modernity, that was more or less the position. It's a redefinition of the singular and the universal, yeah, in a way. It's a way to redefine those elements. I think the main problem of our times is this articulation between the standardization and the fundamentalism, actually. So that's exactly in between those two phenomena that this modernity, if it ever happens, should happen.
Yeah, but I see like my son's generation, they really deal with those two extremes, but I think their search for a new criteria has a lot to do with the individualism of many like esoterian solutions.
Esoteric? Or
Esoteric, yeah. Rather than, but we're still social creatures, right? So what would unite us as social creatures?
Will, a collective will, decisions, nothing more. Nothing more than that, but nothing less. Well, I think one can have the positive vision or let's say a pessimistic one, obviously. I prefer to think that all over the world today, in some places, in some studios, in some, in the heads of a few people, those elements are actually united to produce something that might, that might directly address the fake opposition between standardization and fundamentalism, and thoughts of identitarian thinking, let's say. But if you look at more carefully at what's going on in studios today, it already exists, in some ways. It's under our eyes. Well, let's discuss it as such.
You said that, I'm sorry, I'm archiving my question, as you said. You said that we're looking for a verge of new modernity, and I wanted to ask you if you think we'll achieve again the right to have manifesto for our thoughts, if we can still have manifests after such a long time of relativity, if that's something that could stand, a manifest that will relate to science as it happens now and to evolution as humanity as it happens now.
I think it's an interesting question because it obliges me to say what could be this new modernity and what are the tools and forms it would use, if it has to correspond to our times, in a way. I would say against manifestos, dialogue. Against, radicality, radicantity. Against the linear, the line of progress, wandering. Those are the three elements, and maybe against the idea of the future as the leading value, heterochronia, which is the mixing of times and the acknowledgement of the coexistence of different temporalities in our everyday life. So these four elements are my personal request.
Thank you.
We have some time maybe for one or two more questions.
I'm wondering about, like you said, that in 2001, when the moment when they finished mapping the Earth by satellite was a crucial moment, and then like later you talked about stars and the lights coming from stars, and it made me think about outer space. Not that outer space is a subject that interests many artists, but why do you think that moment in 2001 was so important? Is it just a symbolic thing, or why was it so important?
It was very important because it's the definitive closing of what has been called modern times, which has actually been based, in the from a Western point of view, on the navigation of the conquest, and colonization, in a way, the discovery of the so-called New World, etc., etc. This phenomenon has found its conclusion with the last, drop of blankness, on the map. We are living now in a closed world. That's a huge, phenomenon. It's related, by the way, also to the fact that we not only live in a finite world, we also live in a world which is overproducing more and more all the time. It's this very interesting and underestimated conceptual artist called Douglas Hubler, who in the 60s already was saying, I don't want to produce objects, I don't want to add any more objects to the world which already contains too many. And what would he say now? It's we are living in a finite and overwhelmed world. And in any specialty, whatever it is, geography or contemporary art or sports or whatever, no one is no more able to master the whole amount of knowledge that would mean that he or she, is really aware of everything in his category. It's impossible to have a new Pico della Mirandella, for example. It's impossible to have a new Leonardo da Vinci, because their knowledge was based on the accumulation and the very exhaustive way of accumulating knowledge. Now we can't do that. Even if I devote 100% of my time to try to know what's going on in the studios, in galleries and museums all over the world, it's just impossible. 20 years ago, it was possible. The critical mass of informations has dramatically increased at the same moment that our world was narrowing. So this new configuration is ours, and this we have to answer to.
Maybe the last question.
You're talking about art, contemporary artists as collapsing new time spaces, and when you brought in Borges, I had to wonder, how does that differ from fiction, or what is your relationship to fiction? If I'm thinking about the most Borges-y artwork I've seen is Walid Raad's, miniature retrospective, or even his work in general, and I always wonder about that in relationship to fiction.
When he was asked the question, actually, about the nature of philosophy, Jorge Luis Borges answered that philosophy was only a branch of fantastic literature and almost heroic fantasy, or it's fiction also, according to him. Fiction in the sense that it develops versions of space-time which are all different one to another. You know, of course, the space-time, according to Kant, is not the same one than to Hegel's, for example. So there's a part of fiction because there's a part of storytelling in any theory, whatever it is. And the extreme peak of storytelling is what I'm trying to do when I say, okay, modernism starts at the beginning of 19th century and ends at this moment. And then postmodernism starts in 73 and ends maybe in 2008 with the explosion of the economic bubble and the subprime crisis. Of course, one could say, no, you're totally wrong. No, I don't see the story like this. No, that my story is this one. The fact is, for modernism, for example, it's just a name that we give to a specific story. One could pull a thread that would be totally different and reread the history of art from 19th century till now in a very different way. That would lead to different conclusions. You know, I tend to think that when you don't rewrite history all the time, history dies. History dies because it's killed by truth, which is convention, in a way, another name for it, I think. No, I think the power of the artwork, whatever it is its ability to provoke an infinite dialogue between people. Artworks actually generate, you know, discourses, counter-discourses. You agree, you don't agree. You develop new ideas. You pretend that Pete Mondrian was actually a colorist, whatever. No, you really can dwell on those things because they are passionating, because they contain a huge amount of energy. That's why they are important artworks, actually. Once this is over, what's left? And that's the same thing with any type of discourse, in a way. That's why we need to confront ourselves to the artworks of the past in the spirit of infinite dialogue, like Maurice Blanchot would have said. This infinite dialogue is what really interests me, actually. In the text needs to be commentated, the image also, the forms also need to be commentated all the time. I think that's more important than ever, actually. Not leaving the possibility of this dialogue to stop. That's the most important.
Nicolas Bourriaud, I want to thank you very warm-heartedly for this very two intensive days. Thank you very much.